they rarely speak of what the earth remembers. Beneath the old Henderson plantation in Mon County, Georgia, the soil kept secrets most preferred to leave buried. By 1871, 6 years after the war's end, the land had passed through two owners. Wild growth had reclaimed sections of the cotton fields, and the main house stood with half its windows boarded shut. Yet something about that particular stretch of red clay troubled the men who worked it. Tools struck hollow spaces where none should be. When the rain fell hard, strange echoes rose from underfoot. On quiet mornings when mist clung low to the fields, they swore they heard sounds rising from the earth itself. Sounds that had no business being there. Then, on a humid September morning, they found the boy. He was alive. For 9 days he had been under the ground. What he survived in that darkness would haunt Mon County for generations. The discovery began with a stubborn mule named Jasper. The animal had been pulling a plow across the southeastern field when it stopped dead, refusing to move despite the curses and coaxing of its handler, a freedman named Tobias Wright. Jasper's ears flattened against his head, and he stamped the ground 3 times with a front hoof, the way animals do when they sense something profoundly wrong. Tobias had worked this land for nearly a year, hired as paid labor by Marcus Henderson, or the men claiming to be Marcus Henderson. The arrangement was better than sharecropping. The fate forced upon most former slaves after emancipation proved more legal fiction than practical reality. At least Tobias received actual wages, however meager, instead of remaining perpetually indebted for seed, tools, and the roof over his family's head. Still, the work was hard and thankless. The old plantation had fallen into disrepair during and after the war. Fencing had collapsed and rotted. The slave quarters, the term still used though circumstances had ostensibly changed, were crumbling structures that leaked. The main house, once a grand columned symbol of wealth built on human suffering, stood like a hollow monument to a fallen empire. Its paint peeled in long strips, half the windows were boarded, others gaped empty, their glass long shattered. Henderson, a northern businessman who'd supposedly bought the property at auction, seemed more interested in timber rights than restoring agriculture. "What's got into you, old boy?" Tobias muttered, checking Jasper's hooves for stones. The mule was even-tempered and reliable, which made him valuable despite his age. This behavior was entirely out of character. That's when Tobias noticed the ground beneath the mule's front legs had a different texture. It looked disturbed, recently turned, though no one had worked this section in weeks. The earth had a sunken quality, as if something below had collapsed. Tobias knelt, his knee sinking into the soft red clay, and pressed his palm against the soil. It felt wrong, hollow, as if empty space lay beneath the surface. A cool draft seemed to rise, carrying a smell that made the hair on his neck stand up. Not the smell of death, he knew that too well from the war, but something else, the smell of enclosed air, of spaces sealed away from the world above. He stood quickly, an old fear tightening his chest. He'd heard stories about this place from before the war, whispered in the quarters after the overseers retired. The Henderson plantation had been one of the largest and cruelest in the county. Old-timers spoke of punishment cellars, root cellars, and storage spaces used for darker purposes, and of people who simply disappeared. Tobias had dismissed such tales as dark mythology. But now, feeling that hollow space, the stories felt less like myth and more like buried history trying to claw its way back to the surface. He should have walked away. That would have been safe, smart. But something made him call the other workers. Something made him insist they bring shovels. Samuel Johnson arrived first, a wiry man in his 40s who'd been a blacksmith before the war. He was followed by 2 younger men, brothers named Daniel and Joseph Peters, both in their 20s and still adjusting to the strange reality of being paid, however poorly, for their labor. "What you got here, Tobias?" Samuel asked, eyeing the spot. "I don't know," Tobias admitted. "But there's something hollow under this ground." The 4 men began to dig. The work was slow at first, the clay packed hard by years of rain and sun. But after 2 feet, then 3, the soil became looser. It had been disturbed before. 20 minutes later, their shovels struck wood, not roots or buried timber, but work planks, rotting but unmistakably placed with intention. "Lord have mercy," Samuel whispered, peering into the hole. Tobias used a crowbar to pry at the planks. They collapsed inward with a sound like breaking bones, revealing a larger darkness below, a room carved into the earth. The men stood silent, staring into the opening. The smell rose stronger now, damp earth, rotting wood, stale air that hadn't been breathed in years. Or so they thought. Joseph, the younger Peter's brother, leaned closer. Is that? And then they heard it. A sound so faint it was almost lost beneath the cicadas and the wind through the grass. A voice, small and hoarse, barely human. Help! The word came from the darkness below, from a throat that should have been silent with death but somehow, impossibly, was not. There's someone down there. Daniel shouted. All four men began tearing at the planks, widening the opening, letting light fall into the space. What they saw made them doubt their own eyes. A child, a boy of maybe 11 or 12, lay curled in the corner of what appeared to be a small cellar. His dark skin was covered in red clay, his clothes torn and filthy. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. His eyes squeezed shut against the sudden brightness, tears tracking lines through the dirt. But he was alive. Against all reason, he was alive. Tobias jumped down into the cellar, about 8 feet deep, landing hard on the packed earth floor. Up close, the boy looked worse, emaciated, trembling, breathing shallow and rapid. But when his eyes opened and focused on Tobias, they were sharp and alert, the eyes of someone who had fought to survive. It's all right, Tobias said softly, reaching for him. We've got you. You're safe now. The boy's mouth moved, but only a croak emerged. Tobias noticed with horror that his hands were raw and bloody at the fingertips, where he'd clawed at the wood above. The ceiling showed fresh scratches, splinters driven under his nails in a desperate attempt to dig out. Samuel and the Peters brothers lowered a rope, and together they lifted the boy from his underground prison. On the grass beside the hole, he curled into a ball, trembling despite the afternoon heat. Get water, Tobias ordered. Slowly. Not too much at once. Samuel ran for the well while Tobias knelt beside the boy, gently assessing his injuries. Dehydration, malnutrition, damaged hands, bruises, but miraculously, nothing seemed broken. Can you tell me your name? Tobias asked gently. The boy's mouth moved again, a whisper emerging. Thomas. Thomas what? Hayes. How long have you been down there, Thomas? The boy's eyes closed. His lips formed words that took several attempts. I don't. I lost count. Many days. So many days. Samuel returned with water. They let Thomas drink slowly, small sips at first. He clutched the ladle with his damaged hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. We need to get him to shelter, Joseph said. And a doctor. But Henderson's property was 4 miles from the nearest town, and the nearest doctor who would treat a colored child without upfront payment, money none of them had, was even farther. They would have to make do on their own. They carried Thomas to the sharecropper's cabin where Tobias lived with his wife Ruth and their 3 children. The cabin was small but clean and sturdy. Ruth took one look at the boy in her husband's arms and began issuing orders. Bring him inside. Daniel, Joseph, fetch more water. Samuel, ride into town and see if Doc Ramsey will come. Tell him it's a child near death. Don't take no for an answer. She cleared the table and they laid Thomas on it. Ruth had served as a nurse of sorts during the war, tending to the injured when enslaved people were denied proper medical care. She had experience and intuition. Merciful God, she whispered, examining the abrasions on Thomas's hands and the bruises covering his thin arms. How long did you say he was down there? We don't know for certain, Tobias admitted. But that ground hadn't been disturbed in weeks, maybe longer. Ruth looked at her husband, understanding dawning in her eyes, understanding and a horror that had nothing to do with visible injuries and everything to do with what they implied. No one could survive 9 days without water. 3 days, perhaps 4 under extraordinary circumstances, but beyond that, dehydration shuts down the organs. It was biological fact. Yet here was Thomas Hayes, thin and battered but breathing, his heart beating, his eyes focusing when she spoke. Thomas, she said gently. Can you hear me? A slight nod. I'm going to take care of you. Understand? You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. His mouth moved. She leaned closer. Thank you. Ruth set about cleaning his wounds, giving him more water in measured amounts, and preparing a thin broth. Her children, Emma, 9, William, 7, and Sarah, 5, watched with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama, is he going to die?" Emma asked in a small voice. "No, baby," Ruth said, though she wasn't entirely certain. "He's going to be just fine. Now I need you to be my helpers. William, fetch clean cloths. Emma, mind your sister." The children hurried to their tasks. Samuel returned an hour later with disappointing news. Doc Ramsey wouldn't come, not for a colored child, not without payment, not without more information about the injury. In 1871 Georgia, 6 years after the war, the legal status of former slaves had changed, but the social order remained. A black child found in mysterious circumstances on a white man's property was more likely seen as a problem than a victim. "We'll manage on our own," Ruth said firmly. "We always do." That first night, Thomas slept for 16 hours straight. Ruth checked on him every few hours, half expecting to find him gone. But each time, his heart beat steadily beneath her fingers. When he woke the next morning, his voice had returned enough for broken sentences. The story he told, haltingly, with pauses when memories became difficult, was simple in its facts and impossible in its implications. Thomas Hayes had been alone in the world for longer than a child should be. His mother, Clara Hayes, enslaved on a plantation near Valdosta, had died of fever in the winter of 1869. Thomas was 9. His father, Benjamin Hayes, a field hand consumed by bitterness after Clara's death, disappeared in the spring of 1870. Some said he'd gone north for work, others whispered he'd been lynched. At 10, Thomas fended for himself, finding work where he could, shelter where it was offered, learning invisibility for survival. For the past year, he'd worked as a stable boy for a man named Cyrus Garrett, who owned a small farm 15 miles south of the Henderson Plantation. Garrett wasn't kind, but he wasn't as cruel as some. He paid a small wage, usually on time, and didn't beat the boy unless Thomas made a serious mistake. By the standards of 1871 Georgia, that counted as decent. 9 days ago, or was it 10? Thomas had lost count. Garrett sent him on an errand, deliver a message to someone at the old Henderson plantation. Thomas set out in the early morning, carrying a sealed envelope. The brick pillars at the entrance still stood, though the iron gates were gone. The path through the fields was overgrown but visible. Thomas followed it, calling out occasionally, but the overseer's house Garrett described didn't exist, or hadn't in years. He found only the ruins of a burned structure, a chimney standing like a marker over a grave. While deciding what to do, he heard voices, men's voices, low and angry, coming from ahead through the tall grass and kudzu. Raised to know that an unaccompanied black child had no business listening to white men's conversations, Thomas nonetheless crept closer, curiosity and instinct guiding him. He parted the grass and saw 2 white men standing near an old cellar entrance, half hidden by undergrowth. They were dressed too well to be farmhands. One was tall and lean, in his 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples, wearing a suit jacket despite the heat. The other was shorter and stockier, with a thick brown beard and suspenders, holding a leather satchel. They were arguing, voices intense but controlled. "Don't have that kind of time," the tall man was saying. "He's been asking questions, making inquiries with the county office." "Then we accelerate the timeline," the bearded man replied. "The debt is already arranged. Once the judge receives his payment, the sale will be final. Henderson won't have any legal ground to stand on. Henderson isn't going to accept it. You know that. He's already threatened to go to the federal authorities. Let him try. By the time any investigation begins, the property will have changed hands 3 times over. The paper trail will be impossible to follow. And if he talks before then, if he tells someone what he suspects, then we ensure he can't talk." The bearded man's voice dropped to something cold and flat. "We've come too far to let one self-righteous heir ruin everything. The money we've invested, the arrangements we've made. This needs to conclude quickly." A pause. Then the tall man said, "I don't like it. I didn't sign on for that. You signed on for whatever was necessary. You knew that from the beginning, Price. Don't develop a conscience now. Price." The tall man was named Price. Thomas, focused on the conversation, hadn't noticed the dead branch hidden in the grass behind him. When he shifted his weight, his foot came down on it with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Both men turned instantly, their eyes scanning, landing on Thomas's hiding spot. "There," the bearded man said, pointing. "Someone's watching us." Thomas bolted, running through the field with terror-induced speed. Behind him, he heard them crashing through the undergrowth, shouting. They were older, heavier, but desperate. Thomas didn't know the land. He ran blindly until he saw it, an old root cellar, its entrance partially collapsed. Without thinking, driven by instinct to hide, he scrambled down into it. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, about 8 by 8 feet, with walls of red clay supported by rotting timber beams. It smelled of damp earth and decay. But it was dark and hidden. Thomas crouched in the corner, controlling his breathing, listening to the footsteps above. Then he heard something that made his blood turn to ice. One of them, the bearded man, said, "Did you see which way he went?" "Toward the old storage cellars." Price replied, "He couldn't have gone far. We need to find him." "Why?" "He's just a child. He probably didn't understand anything he heard. We can't take that risk. We find him and we make sure he stays quiet." A pause. Then the bearded man, "Do you hear that?" Thomas realized too late that his terrified breathing was audible in the enclosed space. He clamped a hand over his mouth, but the damage was done. Footsteps approached the cellar entrance. A shadow fell across the opening. "Well, well," the bearded man's voice said from above. "Look what we have here." Thomas pressed himself into the corner. There was no other exit. He was trapped. Price's face appeared in the opening. Their eyes met. Thomas saw conflict, perhaps guilt, but not enough to change what happened next. "What do we do with him?" Price asked. "We buy ourselves time. Help me with these planks." Thomas watched in horror as they dragged boards across the entrance, sealing him in. He scrambled up, trying to push them away, screaming, begging. "I won't tell anyone. I promise. I didn't hear nothing. Please." But they kept working. Within minutes, the entrance was completely sealed. The last thing Thomas saw before darkness claimed the cellar was a sliver of light narrowing to a point, then nothing. He heard them above, shoveling dirt, covering the boards. Then the sound stopped, and Thomas was alone in complete and absolute darkness, buried alive. Thomas told his story over 3 days as his strength returned. Ruth and Tobias listened with growing horror. The part no one could explain, the part that kept Ruth awake at night, was how Thomas had survived those 9 days. The first day was the worst: panic, disbelief, desperate certainty this couldn't be happening. He screamed until his voice gave out, threw himself at the sealed entrance, clawed at the boards until his fingernails split and fingertips bled. He searched every inch of the cellar in the darkness, feeling along the clay walls for a crack, a weakness, any way out. There was none. By the second day, panic gave way to numb acceptance. His throat was raw, his hands too damaged to claw. He had no water, no food. The air felt thick and stale. He curled up in the corner and waited for death. But then things started to change. Thomas struggled to describe it. It wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a gradual awareness that he wasn't entirely alone. He heard sounds, small at first, then unmistakable, voices, faint and distant, whispering. Not words he could make out, just the cadence of human speech. "Are you sure it wasn't just your mind playing tricks?" Tobias asked gently. Thomas shook his head firmly. "It wasn't my imagination. I know what I heard. And I know what happened on the 3rd day. The 3rd day was when he should have died. 3 days without water is the limit for most humans. Dehydration leads to kidney failure, cardiovascular collapse, seizures. Death comes quickly. But on the 3rd day, Thomas heard something that made him lift his head from the packed earth floor, the sound of dripping water. He thought it was another hallucination, but the sound was persistent. Drip. 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 He crawled toward it, feeling along the wall with his damaged hands. And he found it, a place where water was seeping through the clay, gathering in droplets that fell to the floor. Not much, just a slow, steady drip. But it was water. Thomas pressed his mouth to the wall and caught the droplets on his tongue, one by one. It took hours to get enough to make a difference, but it was enough. Enough to keep him alive for one more day. And then another, and another. The water saved you, Ruth said, relieved. But Tobias had doubts. The day after rescuing Thomas, he returned to the cellar with Samuel and the Peters brothers, lanterns in hand. They checked every surface. There was no source of water. The walls were dry, hard-packed clay with no sign of moisture. No pipes, no underground spring, no crack. The cellar was completely dry. Maybe it dried up after we opened it, Samuel suggested. Air getting in changed things. Tobias ran his hand along the wall where Thomas described finding the water. The clay wasn't just dry, it was bone dry, cracked in places, the kind of dryness that takes months or years to develop, not hours. This hasn't been wet in a long time. They stood in the cellar, lanterns casting shifting shadows, trying to make sense of the impossible. Thomas should have died. By every law of nature, he should have died. Maybe the boy's mistaken about where the water was, Daniel offered. Maybe he's confused. Trauma does that. Maybe, Tobias said, but he didn't believe it. Because there was something else he'd found in that cellar, something he hadn't mentioned to Thomas or Ruth, only showing the other men with a gesture that said, "Keep this quiet." In one corner, partially hidden under dirt and debris, were bones, old, weathered, brittle human bones. A femur, ribs, a skull with a crack through the temporal bone. The remains of at least one person who had been down there long before Thomas. And scratched into the wooden support beam nearest those bones, carved with desperate fingers or perhaps a nail, were words, "God have mercy. Help us. Forgive." And dates, or what looked like dates, the numbers rough and partially illegible. 1864 March. 12 days. Someone had been imprisoned in this cellar during the war. Someone had scratched those words while slowly dying. And based on the plural us and the multiple dates, it hadn't been just one person. This place had been used as a prison, a punishment cell, where enslaved people were locked away and forgotten. Tobias stared at those scratches, those desperate pleas to a God who hadn't answered, and felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. Thomas hadn't been alone down there. Not really. "We bury these bones proper," Tobias said quietly. "And we don't tell the boy. He's been through enough without knowing he was sleeping on someone's grave." The other men agreed. They carefully gathered the remains, wrapped them in burlap, and buried them in the far corner of the field, marked with a simple stone. No name, because they didn't know the name. No dates. Just a stone, a prayer, and hope that whoever died there had finally found peace. But the question remained, how had Thomas survived when they had not? Sheriff William Cook arrived at the Henderson property 5 days after Thomas's rescue. A thick-set man in his mid-50s with a handlebar mustache and unreadable eyes, he'd served as sheriff for 12 years, through the war and its aftermath. He was pragmatic, not particularly cruel or sympathetic. His job was to maintain order. He arrived on horseback with Deputy Silas Finch, a younger man with nervous hands. They found Thomas in the cabin, eating vegetable soup at the table. The boy looked up, fear and recognition flickering across his face. "This the boy?" Sheriff Cook asked without pleasantries. "This is Thomas Hayes," Ruth said, moving protectively near him. "He's recovering from a terrible ordeal." "So I've heard. Mind if I ask him some questions?" It wasn't really a question. The sheriff sat, took out a notebook and pencil stub. "Son, tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning." Thomas repeated his story, sent by Cyrus Garrett, overhearing 2 men arguing, being chased, trapped, sealed underground. Sheriff Cook wrote very little, mostly watching Thomas, occasionally asking a clarifying question. "You say you were sent by Cyrus Garrett to deliver a message?" "Yes, sir." "What was the message?" "I don't know, sir. It was in a sealed envelope." "Do you still have this envelope?" "No, sir. I lost it when I was running." "Convenient." The sheriff tapped his pencil. "These 2 men you say trapped you. Can you describe them again?" Thomas described them, the tall man with graying hair, the shorter stocky one with the thick brown beard, their fine clothes, the leather satchel, the argument about debts and timelines and someone named Henderson. "Did they give their names? Did you hear what they called each other?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. One of them called the tallman Price. I heard him say it clear. Something flickered in the sheriff's eyes, recognition or concern, gone quickly. Price. You're certain? Yes, sir. The sheriff closed his notebook with a snap. Son, I spoke to Cyrus Garrett yesterday afternoon. He says he never sent you anywhere. Says he dismissed you from his service 2 weeks ago for stealing feed grain. That's not true. Thomas's voice cracked. I never stole nothing. I was there 9 days ago. I was working in the stables that morning. Mr. Garrett says otherwise. And Mr. Garrett is a respected member of this community, a landowner, a taxpayer. The meaning was clear. Garrett's word mattered more than a black child's truth. Ruth's hand tightened on Thomas's shoulder. Sheriff, this boy was buried alive. We pulled him from that cellar ourselves. Are you saying he somehow dug himself down there and sealed himself up? That he tore up his own hands and starved himself for 9 days just to get attention? I'm not saying anything except what I know, Mrs. Wright. And what I know is that I've got no evidence of any crime being committed. The Henderson property has been abandoned for years. Vagrants and runaways use it for shelter. Could be the boy fell into that cellar by accident. Could be the entrance collapsed naturally. Could be a lot of things. Except I heard one of them called Price, Thomas insisted. That's a name. Price is a common name, son. And even if you did hear it, that doesn't mean anything. Could have been anyone. Could have been your imagination. Tobias stepped forward, voice controlled despite anger. Sheriff, we found bones in that cellar. Human bones. And writing on the walls, pleas for help, dates from during the war. That place was used to imprison people, to kill people. Doesn't that warrant investigation? For the first time, Sheriff Cook looked uncomfortable. The war was a difficult time. A lot of things happened that were better off leaving in the past. Digging up old bones doesn't help anyone move forward. You understand. The message was clear: the bones, the victims, would not be investigated. Their suffering would remain officially unacknowledged. As for the boy's story, the sheriff continued, I'll make some inquiries. See if anyone matching those descriptions has been seen. But without evidence, without witnesses, there's not much I can do. He headed for the door, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Wright. I'd advise you to keep the boy close. If his story is true, and I'm not saying it is, but if it is, then whoever put him in that cellar might not be pleased to learn he's still alive and talking. Might decide to finish what they started. After the sheriff left, the cabin was silent. Then Ruth pulled Thomas close. They're not going to help us. We're on our own. Thomas nodded against her shoulder. He'd known that already. In 1871 Georgia, a black child's word meant nothing against a white man's denial. Justice, if it came, would have to come from somewhere other than the law. The next 2 weeks passed in suspension. Thomas regained strength, his hands healed, but he didn't speak much about what happened. He had trouble sleeping, waking multiple times each night, sitting bolt upright, eyes wide. He'd murmur in his sleep, have conversations with someone only he could hear. During the day, he'd sometimes stop and tilt his head as if listening, eyes distant. You all right, son? Tobias asked once when Thomas stood motionless by the window. Thomas blinked. Yes, sir. Sorry. I thought I heard something. Heard what? I don't know. Voices maybe. Or wind. It's nothing. I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. The experience had left scars deeper than the ones on his hands. The real trouble started 12 days after the rescue. Tobias woke to the cabin door creaking open. In the moonlight, he saw Thomas standing in the doorway, staring into the night. Thomas, Tobias whispered. What are you doing? The boy didn't respond. Tobias crossed to him, put a hand on his shoulder. Thomas jumped, startled. Mr. Wright, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. What are you doing out here? I heard someone calling. I thought maybe someone needed help. There's no one out there. It's the middle of the night. But I heard them. Clear as I hear you now. Tobias guided him back inside. Sometimes our minds play tricks when we're half asleep, especially after what you've been through. Try to rest. Thomas nodded, but as he lay back down, Tobias saw him turn to face the door, eyes open and alert, watching. It happened again the next night, and the night after. Thomas would wake, drawn by voices only he could hear, calling from the darkness. On the fifth night, he finally spoke of it. "They want me to come back," he told Ruth. "They want me to remember them." Who? The people who died there. In the cellars, in the fields. All the people who suffered and no one ever knew. Ruth felt a chill. "Thomas, the people who died there are gone. They're at rest." "Are they?" His voice was quiet but intense. "How can they rest when no one remembers them? When their bones are in unmarked graves and their names are erased? It's like they never existed. We remember them. Mr. Wright and the others buried those bones proper. They said prayers. That's not enough." Thomas's hands clenched. "Don't you understand? I was down there with them. I felt them keeping me alive, guiding me to the water, telling me not to give up. They saved me so I could tell their story. So someone would finally know." Ruth didn't know what to say. She settled for pulling him into a hug. "We know what happened. We know and will remember. That's all we can do." But it wasn't all. 3 nights later, on a Saturday when the moon was dark, someone set fire to the old Henderson main house. Daniel Peters, walking home, saw the orange glow against the sky. He roused people, and within 20 minutes a dozen men gathered, but it was too late. The mansion, dry as kindling from years of neglect, burned with terrifying speed. Tobias arrived with Samuel and found Thomas among the crowd, staring at the inferno with an unreadable expression. "How did this start?" Tobias asked Daniel. "Don't know. Could have been anything. Lightning, vagrants, or deliberate. They watched for hours as the fire consumed the mansion." Samuel noticed the smell first. "You smell that? That ain't just wood burning." Tobias smelled it too, something organic, sickly sweet, the smell of burning meat. "There's someone in there," Samuel said, horror dawning. Someone was in the house. The heat drove them back. If someone was inside, they were beyond help. At dawn, when the fire burned out, they moved through the ruins. In what had been a study, they found a body, charred beyond recognition, burned down to bone in places. Definitely human, definitely adult, definitely dead before the fire started. Deputy Finch arrived, examined the body dispassionately, called for the doctor. While they waited, Tobias found a strongbox in the burned study, partially buried under collapsed brickwork. The metal box had a lock melted by heat. Tobias pried it open. Inside, protected from the worst flames, were papers, contracts, deeds, and a ledger, pages scorched but readable. Tobias read, and with each page, his understanding sharpened into terrible focus. The ledger told a story of fraud, corruption, and murder. The Henderson plantation hadn't been sold to any northern businessman named Marcus Henderson. That was a fiction created by a lawyer named Jonathan Price and his associate, Martin Chambers. The real heir was Robert Henderson, nephew of the original owner, who'd returned after the war to claim his inheritance only to find the property supposedly sold to pay non-existent debts. Robert Henderson had been fighting the sale in court, gathering evidence to take to federal authorities. Price and Chambers grew desperate. The ledger detailed payments to corrupt officials, discussions about the Henderson problem, and how to resolve it permanently. The most damning entry was dated September 3, 1871, 3 days before Thomas was sent on his errand, meeting with Chambers at the old storage cellars. Discussed final payment to Judge Morrison and timeline for completing the sale. R. Henderson continues to be an obstacle. Chambers suggests more direct solution. I expressed reservations but acknowledge we may have no choice if legal channels fail. Matter must be concluded by month's end, or our creditors will demand repayment. We cannot provide. The entry for September 6, the day Thomas was trapped, was brief, incident at the property, unforeseen complication. Chambers handled it. Hope we have bought sufficient time. Thomas hadn't imagined anything. He'd witnessed a criminal conspiracy discussing murder. And when he overheard, they tried to eliminate him too. Tobias showed the ledger to Samuel and Daniel. Their anger mounted. This was the reality of 1871, old power structures finding new ways to maintain control, opportunists exploiting chaos, the law bought and sold. When Sheriff Cook arrived, Tobias handed him the ledger. The sheriff read it, expression unreadable, then closed it. "Where did you find this?" "In the ruins." "In a metal box in the study." Sheriff Cook was silent a long moment. "Jonathan Price is a respected lawyer in this county. He's handled matters for prominent citizens. Accusations like this, they're not accusations. It's his own writing. And that boy told you the truth." "The boy said he heard someone called Price." "That could be anyone. How many lawyers named Price are there in Mon County?" The sheriff didn't answer. He tucked the ledger under his arm. "I'll look into this quietly. If what's in here is true, we've got a serious problem. But if it's not, making accusations against a man like Price could cause trouble." "And what about Thomas Hayes?" "The fact that he was nearly killed." "I'll look into it. That's all I can promise." But his eyes carried a different message. "This involves people with power. Tread carefully." After the sheriff left, Tobias told Ruth and Thomas what he'd found. Thomas listened with vindication mixed with fear. "So I was right. They were planning to kill someone, and they tried to kill me because I heard them." "Looks that way," Tobias confirmed. "Now we have proof. The sheriff can't ignore this." "Can't he?" Ruth's voice was bitter. "You heard him. He's already looking for ways to protect Price." She was right. But the ledger was evidence too many had seen. Something would have to happen. The body in the burned mansion was identified 3 days later, Robert Henderson. Preliminary examination suggested he'd been dead several days, possibly a week, with trauma to the back of the skull. Murder, and the fire set to cover it up. The revelation sent shockwaves. Federal authorities were called in. U.S. Marshals took over the investigation. Jonathan Price was brought in for questioning. He maintained innocence, claimed the ledger was a forgery or misinterpreted, denied knowing Robert Henderson, denied meetings at the old cellars, denied involvement in the death. "I don't know any Thomas Hayes. The child is either mistaken or lying." But Martin Chambers, arrested trying to board a train in Atlanta with cash and falsified documents, broke down. He confessed to the fraudulent sale, the bribes, the forged documents, the meetings. He admitted seeing Thomas that day, chasing him, trapping him in the cellar, sealing him in. "I thought he'd die quickly. 2 days, maybe 3. I thought it would be over and no one would ever know." "You tried to murder a child," the marshal said. "I never touched him. I just locked him away. I didn't think." But Chambers denied killing Robert Henderson. "That was Price. I didn't want any part of it. Price said we'd gone too far, invested too much. He said Henderson had to be dealt with." Confronted with Chambers' testimony, Price maintained innocence, but evidence was overwhelming: the ledger in his handwriting, the forged documents, Thomas's testimony, Chambers' confession. The trial began in spring 1872, lasting 3 weeks, sensational, crowded. Thomas testified, with Tobias and Ruth beside him. He spoke clearly despite fear, described the argument, the chase, the terror, pointed at Price and Chambers. "Those are the men who put me in the cellar. Those are the men who tried to kill me." The defense tried to discredit him, suggesting confusion, faulty memory. Thomas didn't waver. "I know what I heard. I know what I saw." The jury, all white men, as required by law, returned a verdict: guilty of fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder of a minor. Jonathan Price and Martin Chambers were each sentenced to 20 years in the state penitentiary. The murder charge for Robert Henderson was more complicated. Without enough direct evidence, the judge ruled the prosecution hadn't met its burden of proof. Price and Chambers would be imprisoned for proven crimes, but Robert Henderson's death would remain officially unsolved. It wasn't perfect justice, but in 1872 Georgia, it was more than most expected a black child to receive. Thomas stayed with Tobias and Ruth for 2 years after the trial. They formally took him in, gave him their name, Thomas Wright, though he remembered his mother's name, Hayes, and would eventually reclaim it. They raised him as their own. The experience never left him entirely. He still had nightmares, still woke sometimes with his heart pounding. But gradually, with time and love, he began to heal. He learned to read under Ruth's instruction, learned farming from Tobias, though he never fully lost his fear of the earth. Sometimes Ruth heard him talking in his sleep, having conversations with someone. When asked, he'd say he didn't remember his dreams. But once, only once, he spoke of it directly. It was a rainy afternoon in November 1873, 2 years after his rescue. Thomas was 13, taller, stronger, voice beginning to change, but still with that peculiar intensity in his eyes. He and Tobias were repairing a fence when Thomas stopped and looked at the ground. It wasn't empty down there. Tobias stilled. What wasn't empty? The cellar. When I was trapped, it wasn't empty. There were others. A chill ran down Tobias's spine. Others? What do you mean? Thomas was quiet a long moment. In the dark, after the first day, when I thought I was going to die, I heard them. Voices, whispers. People who'd been down there before me, people who didn't get out. His eyes were distant. They showed me where the water was dripping. Even though you didn't find any water when you went back, I know what I experienced. They told me where to put my mouth against the wall. They told me to drink slowly, to stay still, to conserve strength. He paused, voice softer. They kept me company in the darkness when I was so scared I thought my heart would stop. They talked to me, told me I wasn't alone. Told me stories about their lives, the people they'd loved, what they'd hoped to do if they ever got free. They kept me sane. And when I heard Jasper stomping above me on that 9th day, when I heard you all digging, they told me to call out. Told me to use the last of my strength to make myself heard. They told me I was going to be saved. Tobias wanted to say it was impossible, fever dreams, hallucinations. But he'd seen the scratches on the walls, the pleas for mercy. He'd found and buried the bones. And he'd never been able to explain the water. Did they tell you their names? Tobias asked finally, voice rough. Thomas shook his head. They didn't have names anymore. They'd been forgotten so long that their names had faded. They were just voices, memories, echoes of people who used to be. He looked up, eyes clear and direct. But they helped me live. They made sure I didn't give up. They saved me so someone would finally know they'd been there. So someone would finally tell their story and they wouldn't just be forgotten bones. We buried them proper, Tobias said quietly. With prayers. And people know about them now because of what happened. Because of you. I know. And I think that's why they're quiet now. Why I don't hear them anymore. Thomas smiled slightly, sadly. They found what they needed. Someone to remember them. Someone to make sure their suffering wasn't erased. He turned back to the fence, resumed working. Tobias, after a moment, did the same. They never spoke of it again. By 1875, Thomas was 15, ready to make his own way. Tobias helped him secure a position with a railroad company expanding through Georgia. Thomas left with promises to write, visit, never forget. He kept those promises. Letters arrived regularly, describing his work, travels, new people. The railroad took him west through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, into Texas. He worked hard, saved money, learned skills, became a surveyor's assistant, then crew foreman, eventually rising to responsibility despite color barriers. In Texas, he met Elizabeth Carter, a schoolteacher. They married in 1882 when Thomas was 24, started a family, 4 children over the years. Thomas built the life his mother had hoped for him. He never returned to Georgia, never mentioned the Henderson plantation in letters. That chapter seemed sealed away. But he never forgot. He told his children, your history matters. Not just the history in books, but the history of people who never made it into books. The people who were forgotten, whose names were erased, whose stories were buried, they matter. It's our job to remember them. Tobias Wright died in 1889 at 62, worn out from decades of hard labor. The funeral was attended by most of the black community. Tobias had been respected for his fairness, quiet strength, willingness to stand up for what was right even when dangerous. At the funeral, a tall, well-dressed man arrived, one the Wright children didn't immediately recognize. It was Thomas, now 31, returned from Texas to pay respects. He stayed a week, helping Ruth sort through Tobias's belongings, sharing stories with the grown Wright children, being present in grief. On his last evening, he asked Ruth to walk with him. They followed familiar paths through fields that had changed hands since the Henderson property was broken up and sold. The old main house was gone, just a foundation covered in kudzu. The cellar had been filled in and planted over. Thomas stood at the spot where he'd been pulled from the ground, silent a long time. Finally, he spoke. I owe him everything. He didn't have to dig that day. He could have ignored what Jasper was telling him, moved the mule, kept working. Most men would have. It was safer. He was a good man, Ruth said simply. He did what was right. Do you think they found peace? Thomas asked suddenly. The people who were down there before me, the ones who didn't survive. Ruth looked at him carefully. Do you still believe they were there? That it wasn't just your mind trying to cope? Thomas knelt, placed his palm against the earth, the same gesture Tobias had made years before. I know what I experienced. I know I should have died down there. By all logic, by all laws of nature, I should have died. 3 days without water kills a person. But I was down there for 9 days, Mrs. Wright. 9 days. He stood, brushing red clay from his hand, looked at her directly. Something kept me alive. Whether it was God or the spirits of people who'd suffered there or just my body's stubborn refusal to give up, I'll never know. Maybe all of those. Maybe none. But I've spent every day since trying to live in a way that honors it. Whatever saved me, I owe it my life. So I live it well. I live it fully. I make it count. I raise my children to be good people. I help others. And I make sure people remember that history didn't just happen to important folks in big houses. It happened to ordinary people, suffering people, people whose names nobody wrote down but who mattered just as much. Ruth pulled him into a hug. They'd be proud. All of them, wherever they are. Tobias, those people from the cellar, your mama who I never met but raised a strong son. They'd all be proud of the men you've become. They stood together as the sun set over fields that had witnessed so much suffering and somehow occasionally produced moments of grace. Thomas Hayes lived until 1934, dying at 76 in San Antonio, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who loved him. His obituary mentioned only that he'd been a railroadman, a devoted husband and father, a pillar of his community. But among his personal effects, his family found a letter sealed and marked to be opened after my death. In it, Thomas had written the full account of his ordeal, including the parts he'd never told anyone except Tobias. He wrote about the voices, the cool hand guiding him to water, the whispered encouragements, the feeling of not being alone. And he wrote about the promise he'd made in that cellar, if I survive this, I will make sure people know you were here. I will make sure your stories are told. You won't be forgotten. I swear it. The letter ended with an instruction, bury this account with me so that it goes into the earth just as I once did. Let it rest there with the stories it contains. Let that be enough. His family honored his wish. The letter was placed in his casket. Thomas Hayes was laid to rest beneath a headstone bearing his name, dates, and the inscription, "He lived well." Meanwhile, in Georgia, the Henderson plantation land continued its transformation. In the 1950s, remaining parcels were sold for residential development. Houses were built over old fields, roads paved, new families moved in with no knowledge of what happened decades before. The developers filled in the old cellar completely, poured a concrete foundation, built a ranch house on the spot. A young couple bought it in 1958, raised 3 children, planted a garden, added a patio. A normal house on a normal street. But residents sometimes reported strange things, the sound of water dripping in basements with no pipes, a feeling of hollowness underfoot in certain spots, voices on the wind at night, too faint to make out words, indentations in yards after rain, as if the earth was settling over spaces beneath. No one investigated. No one dug. The stories had faded into local folklore, mentioned half-jokingly at barbecues. Oh, this land used to be a plantation, supposedly haunted. But aren't they all? The bones Tobias and the others buried in 1871 still rest in an unmarked spot in someone's backyard. Their location forgotten. The names of those who died in that cellar, the details of their suffering, the circumstances of their deaths, all forgotten, erased from official history if they were ever included at all. But the ground remembers. People don't understand that. The earth holds on to things, keeps records in its own way. Blood soaked into soil doesn't disappear. Bones buried deep don't cease to exist. Suffering leaves marks that persist long after the suffering has ended. And sometimes, in places where suffering was especially intense, those marks become more than memories. They become presences, echoes of people denied justice, recognition, even the basic dignity of being remembered. Were those voices Thomas heard real? Did the dead truly guide him, keep him alive? Or was it all in his mind, the desperate hallucinations of a dying brain trying to maintain hope? The question can never be fully answered. Thomas believed what he believed, lived his life according to that belief, found meaning in an experience that should have killed him. And in the end, maybe that's what matters, not whether the voices were literally real, but whether his survival served a purpose, whether his testimony brought some measure of justice, whether his life honored the memory of those who suffered and died there. He kept his promise. He made sure people knew. For a little while, at least, the forgotten were remembered. That may not seem like much, but to those who died unknown and unmarked, maybe it was everything. The Henderson plantation is gone now, transformed into suburban houses, sidewalks, mowed lawns. People live normal lives, unaware of the history beneath their feet. And that's probably how it should be. Life moves forward. The past can't paralyze the present. But on certain nights when the wind is right and the moon is dark, if you stand where the old cellar used to be, you might hear something, a whisper, a sigh, the faint sound of someone calling for help. It's probably just the wind, the settling of old structures, ordinary sounds of earth and air and time passing. Probably. But then again, maybe not. Maybe the ground still remembers. Maybe it always will. And maybe somewhere in the darkness beneath the surface, voices are still whispering, still telling their stories, still waiting for someone to listen. Thomas Hayes listened. He heard them. He survived because of them, or at least he believed he did. And he made sure, for as long as he could, that they weren't forgotten. That's his legacy. Not the successful career, not the family he raised, not the years he lived or money he earned. His legacy is that he bore witness. He remembered. He told the story. And now you know it, too. The boy who survived 9 days buried beneath a plantation. The child who should have died but didn't. The voice that spoke for those who'd been silenced. His story is finished now, told and recorded and passed on. But the stories of those who didn't survive, those are still there, still waiting, still hoping someone will remember. The ground knows. The earth holds their secrets. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear them.